everybody, my name is Helen, or Lenny, and I'm just gonna catch you up. It is hard to believe, at least for me, but it has been almost 3 years since I posted anything on this channel, which also means it's been almost 3 years since I've been consistently reading anything. And today I figured I would go through my list of books that I read while I was gone and just tell you what I rated them. And maybe I'll end it with my November wrap up. So for the last couple years, the vast majority of what I've been reading has been for school. I was very rarely reading for fun. This list definitely shows that. Let's get started. The first book that I read was Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. I read this for my science fiction literature course, and I gave it 3 stars. Number 2 was Rules for Stealing Stars by Corey Ann Haydu, which I was reading for a video that I had planned way back before, where I was going to read the favorite books of some of my favorite booktubers, and this one was from Nikki over at ExoNikki, but obviously because I stopped making content, that video is not happening, but I did really enjoy it and I gave it 4 stars. Number 3 was My Lovely Wife by Samantha Shannon, which was also going to be read for that video. That one was going to be for Kayla from Books and Lala. I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Number 4 was Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This I also read for my science fiction literature course, and I gave it 3 stars. Number 5 was Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, which I also read for my science fiction course, and I gave 2 stars. Number 6 was Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. I read this one for my genre writing course. I gave Akata Witch 3 stars. Number 7 was Son of a Trickster by Eden Robinson. This I also read for that genre fiction class, and I gave it 3 stars. Next was The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, which is actually something that has been on my to-read list for forever, because everything I've read from Neil Gaiman I've absolutely loved, but I ended up reading it for the genre fiction course, and not surprising to me at all, it was 5 stars. Next was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. I read this for my science fiction class. I did not finish it. I hated it. And I did not like the film Blade Runner either, so apparently it just was not for me in any capacity. And then I read Well Met by Jen DeLuca. This is one of the last books that I read before the event that made me stop reading for fun. I really enjoyed it though, and I gave it 4 stars. Then I read Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. I read this on recommendation from a friend of mine from my old university, who thought that with everything I was going through at the time, it might be helpful for me to read. And she was right. I ended up actually really enjoying it, even though some of it I didn't feel was for me, but I also gave it 4 stars. And then I reread The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I loved it just as much as I remember loving it in high school. I'm probably going to be due for another reread of it pretty soon, because I'm realizing I have again forgotten a lot of it, but I think it's safe to say it's still my favorite classic that I have read, and I gave it 5 stars. Then I read Lola Leroy by Frances E.W. Harper. I read this for a literature course that I cannot specifically remember, and that should tell you how much of an impact it made on me. I did give this 3 stars though. Then I read Description of a New World Called the Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish. I read this for, it was a gender in literature course. I'm not gonna lie to you, I was super depressed while I was going through this, and a lot of what happened during that time is gone from my brain. I did not finish this book, but I do remember the discussions around it being super interesting. Then I read Christie's Great Idea by Anne Martin, which is the first book in the Babysitter's Club series. I used to read the Babysitter's Club when I was a kid, and when the first season of the Netflix series came out, I wanted to read the first few books. I was gonna try to read a bunch of them, only got through the first one, but it was really fun to go back and be in that, I was gonna say in that world, but it's not a different world, but be back in that happy place. And I gave it 3 stars. Then I read Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I remember loving the atmosphere and hating the ending. and I ended up giving it 3 stars, but it made me want to read like everything that Sylvia Moreno Garcia ever puts out. And then I read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I read this for a literature course that was specifically on Harry Potter, which I took because I knew it was going to be an easy grade, and it was. Then I read Throne of Glass by Sarah J Maas, and I'm super behind on reading that. I do own the entire series because I ended up enjoying the first one a lot. I gave it like 4.25 stars, thought it was really fun, and therefore I want to keep reading it. Then I read Witches of Ash and Ruin by E. Latimer. I started this when it came out in 2020, and I did not finish it until 2021. Book was good. It was very fun. I love Erin, the writer. She's a good friend of mine, and this book is wonderfully gay and wonderfully witchy and wonderfully dark. And I gave it 3.5 stars. Then I read Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. I read this for my novel writing course, and I ended up really, really loving it. It's probably one of the best books I've had to read for school. I gave it 4.5 stars. It was just very strange, but in a great way. Then I read Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough, and I read this while I was home for Christmas last year, I think, which is kind of bonkers. I know why a lot of people don't like Sarah Pinborough, and we'll actually get to that kind of soon. But Behind Her Eyes, I thought was very fun, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I read Julius Caesar by Shakespeare for my Shakespeare course, and I gave it 2 stars. Then I read Antony and Cleopatra for the same course, gave it 2.5 stars. Then I read A Pale View of Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro for my novel writing course, and I gave it 3 stars, and I thought it was very interesting, but I felt like there was some of the setup that didn't pay off, and I think I just wasn't reading it critically enough. I think it would be a book that would benefit from a reread. Then I read King Lear and gave it 2 stars. And then in a little break, a little reprieve for myself, I read the Caleb Widogast Origins comic from Critical Role, which was very fun. I have been loving the Critical Role comics. I still love Critical Role, even though I am super far behind again, but I gave this comic 4 stars. Then I read Othello, which I gave 2 stars. I hate Othello. I've read it like 3 times now, and I hate it. Then I read The Tempest, which out of the stories that I had to read for Shakespeare, it was probably one of my favorite ones that I read. I gave it 4 stars, and I thought it was very fun. Then I read A Snake Falls to Earth by Darcy Littlebadger. I was really looking forward to reading this book. I thought that it would be something that I'd end up really enjoying, and for a long time I was, but it's I felt like it was just a little too long, and I was actually like way more invested in Nina's sections than Ollie's sections, and it took too long for those 2 sections to meet, in my opinion. I gave it 3 stars. I didn't dislike it by any means, just wasn't a favorite. Then I read All of Us Villains by Amanda Foody and Christina Lynn Herman, which I listened to the audiobook for it from my library, and I ended up loving it so much. I gave it 4 stars. The audiobook is great. I highly recommend it. Then I read Final Girls by Riley Sager. This was my first Riley Sager. Hi, baby. And it had me like super gripped really early on. I read it very quickly, and then I got to the end, and the end was just kind of fine. I gave it 3 stars. Then I read Rebel Rising by Beth Revis. This is a Star Wars book, and it's following Jyn from her childhood until the events in Rogue One. I was reading this because I was dating someone who was obsessed with Star Wars, and then we broke up, so I don't want to read it anymore. I DNF'd it. Then I read the Yasha comic from Critical Role, the Yasha Origins comic. It was fine. Hey, Riff. I gave it 3 stars. And then I read a non-fiction book called Too Fat, Too Slutty, Too Loud by Anne Helen Peterson, and it was like a series of essays about how different women in media are being unruly and how that is going against the grain in some way, and in whatever way they are being unruly. And I was really liking it, and then one of the cats peed on it. And I had to throw it out. So I never finished it, but based on what I had read from it, I gave it 3 stars. And those are all the books I read while I was away. I thought about doing my November wrap-up in here, but I think I'm gonna wait, because I actually read a few books, and I'll remember them enough to talk about them. Unlike most of these. If you read any of the books that I mentioned, you should let me know what you thought of them down in the comments below. I do respond to every comment on my videos, and I absolutely love hearing from you, and I'll see you soon with a new video. Bye-bye!